The public break came in Jerusalem. At a cabinet meeting on August 9th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel rejected the 15-point document associated with President Trump's Board of Peace. He repeated the point for emphasis. Israel would not accept the framework as written. The disagreement centered on sequencing. Trump's framework envisioned a phased process. Hamas would surrender weapons in stages, an international stabilization force would help secure Gaza, and Israeli forces would withdraw as disarmament proceeded. Netanyahu demanded the reverse condition. Israel, he said, would not withdraw until Hamas was genuinely disarmed, not merely stripped of heavy weapons, but disarmed, deprived of lighter weapons and all other military capabilities. The difference was not a technical footnote. It was the entire mechanism of the plan. Trump's approach treated withdrawal and disarmament as linked steps in a negotiated process. Netanyahu's position made complete disarmament a prerequisite for withdrawal, one document, two interpretations, and an alliance management problem that neither leader could easily hide. The confusion began more than a week earlier. On July 30th, Trump announced that his Board of Peace had reached an agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza. He described it as a historic milestone and said implementation would occur in phases. The proposed process included an Israeli military withdrawal, a new Palestinian police structure, an international stabilization force, and a future Palestinian administration working with the Board of Peace. But the announcement immediately contained an unresolved contradiction. Hamas's reported acceptance was conditional. A senior Hamas official linked the group's willingness to surrender weapons to the deployment of an international force in Israel's compliance with obligations under the ceasefire framework. Israel's position was also conditional. Israeli officials had expressed reservations, and Netanyahu's office said the framework did not reflect Israel's positions before the prime minister formally rejected it. So the agreement was not a simple handshake between three parties. Trump wanted a visible path from ceasefire to governance and reconstruction. Hamas sought security guarantees and reciprocal Israeli steps. Netanyahu demanded that disarmament come first and be comprehensive. The word agreement concealed the central question. Agreement on what, exactly? The first warning was not Netanyahu's final rejection. It was the language surrounding the plan itself. The Board of Peace described a roadmap intended to deliver an Israeli withdrawal, a Gaza free from Hamas control, and reconstruction under Palestinian administration. But the roadmap did not eliminate the hardest operational questions. Who would physically collect weapons? Who would verify that hidden weapons had been surrendered? What would happen if Hamas handed over heavy weapons but retained smaller arms? Who would control territory during the transition? And who would decide whether Israel had complied with its withdrawal obligations? These are not merely diplomatic details. In any ceasefire, verification determines whether promises become policy. Netanyahu's public remarks suggested that he did not trust a partial or symbolic version of disarmament. He warned against what he called fictitious disarmament. That position also carried political consequences inside Israel. Netanyahu was under pressure from far-right ministers opposed to concessions in Gaza, while facing a key military backer in Washington. But Gaza was not the only place where the alliance was under pressure. The story actually widened in Iran. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States began a joint aerial bombing campaign against Iran. The opening phase was described by both Trump and Netanyahu as pursuing regime change. 2 days later, Trump publicly emphasized narrower American military objectives, dismantling Iran's missile capabilities and navy, and preventing Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth also said the operation was not a so-called regime change war. Netanyahu continued to urge Iranians to rise against their leaders. He said Israel would create circumstances allowing the Iranian people to take control of their future. This was the first major strategic divergence. Israel's political leadership was speaking in terms of transforming Iran's government. The Trump administration was emphasizing military capabilities and nuclear prevention, at least in its public explanation. That does not prove the United States and Israel had incompatible end goals. Governments routinely use different language for domestic and international audiences. It does, however, establish that their publicly stated priorities were not identical. The distinction mattered because war aims determine exit conditions. If the goal is to destroy nuclear and missile capabilities, a campaign may end after military objectives are judged complete. If the goal includes regime change, the conflict may continue until political conditions inside Iran shift. The same military operation can therefore produce two different definitions of victory. At first, the partnership looked unusually close. Trump and Netanyahu had coordinated military operations against Iran for months, while negotiations with Tehran were also being pursued through Oman. An Israeli official said the timing of the attack had been determined weeks earlier. Trump later said that ending the war would be a mutual decision with Netanyahu. In an interview, he described the decision as shared while also saying he would determine when the timing was appropriate. The wording itself revealed the problem. Mutual suggested joint ownership of the campaign. I will determine suggested presidential authority over the American decision. Both ideas could coexist politically, but they could not indefinitely avoid the question of command. Who controlled escalation? Who controlled the timing of negotiations? Who decided whether a military objective had been met? The public record does not establish that either leader secretly overruled the other in every decision. It does show a partnership in which the two governments had overlapping but not identical strategic interests. For Netanyahu, Iran represented a long-term existential threat and a chance to weaken or remove the leadership of a regional adversary. For Trump, Iran also represented a test of American leverage, military credibility, and his promise to impose outcomes through pressure. Those motives overlap. They are not the same. Then another issue entered the relationship: Turkey and the F-35. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth canceled a meeting scheduled with Netanyahu. An Israeli source said the meeting had been expected to include discussion of a possible American sale of F-35 fighter jets to Turkey, with Iran also expected to feature in the talks. The source was anonymous, so the details should be treated as strongly reported rather than independently established. Netanyahu had already made his opposition public. In an interview, he argued that selling F-35s to Turkey would damage the regional balance of power, because in his view, Turkey had aggressive aspirations. Trump, meanwhile, had signaled a willingness to improve relations with Ankara. He announced the lifting of sanctions connected to Turkey's purchase of Russian S-400 air defense systems and indicated openness to selling F-35s to the NATO member. The dispute was not only about aircraft. The F-35 is an advanced stealth fighter. Its sale involves questions about regional military balances, technology protection, NATO politics, and the consequences of Turkey's earlier purchase of the Russian S-400 system. For Israel, a possible Turkish F-35 fleet could alter the military environment around the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. For Trump, repairing relations with a NATO ally could support a broader strategy involving regional diplomacy and American influence. There is no public evidence that the F-35 dispute caused Netanyahu's rejection of the Gaza document. The issues are connected by alliance management, not by proof of a single coordinated plan. But together they created a pattern. Netanyahu wanted security guarantees and military freedom. Trump wanted diplomatic flexibility and a wider regional coalition. The second piece of evidence came from the later discussion of Iran. Trump and Netanyahu had explored diplomacy, economic pressure, and military force as possible ways to curb Iran's nuclear program. An Israeli official said the options included a negotiated deal, continued blockade and economic pressure, and a massive strike. That account also rejected the idea that Netanyahu had simply forced Trump into escalation. The Israeli official said the allies shared intelligence, and that Netanyahu had not told Trump Israel's preference was for further attacks. This matters because the popular version of the relationship is often too simple. One version says Netanyahu controls Trump. Another says Trump controls Netanyahu. The available evidence supports neither absolute explanation. Instead, the partnership appears transactional and issue-specific. On Iran, the two leaders could cooperate militarily while disagreeing over the definition of success. On Gaza, Trump could pursue a phased diplomatic framework, while Netanyahu rejected its central sequencing. On Turkey, Washington could seek strategic flexibility while Jerusalem warned against changing the regional balance. The alliance was not collapsing. It was being negotiated in public. By late July, Washington had reasons to celebrate. Trump could point to a reported disarmament agreement, international participation, and a plan for Gaza's future governance. The Board of Peace presented the roadmap as a mechanism for Israeli withdrawal and reconstruction. But the framework's success required Israeli participation. The document could outline withdrawal, stabilization, and reconstruction. It could not physically move Israeli forces without Israeli authorization. Netanyahu's office had already signaled reservations. By August 9th, the Prime Minister moved from reservation to rejection. The result was a confrontation over what American leadership means in an alliance. Does Washington set the framework and expect an ally to implement it? Or does the ally retain a veto when its government believes the plan creates unacceptable security risks? Trump's Board of Peace could claim an agreement with Hamas. Netanyahu could say Israel did not accept the document. Both statements could exist simultaneously because the parties had not agreed on the same implementation conditions. The first major payoff was therefore also the first major failure. Trump had announced the breakthrough before securing full Israeli buy-in. The story actually started earlier, not with the August rejection, and not even with the July F-35 dispute. It began with the structure of the relationship. The United States supplies Israel with political, military, and diplomatic support. Israel, in turn, is a highly capable regional partner whose intelligence and military operations shape American choices. But partnership does not erase sovereignty. Israel can resist Washington. Washington can pressure Israel. Each side can calculate that the costs of disagreement are lower than the costs of accepting the other side's preferred policy. That is the basic condition behind the Gaza dispute. Netanyahu's domestic coalition had reasons to oppose a plan that appeared to permit Israeli withdrawal before Hamas's complete disarmament. Far-right ministers were angered by concessions in Gaza. Trump had reasons to advance a plan that could demonstrate diplomatic momentum, mobilize Arab and Muslim partners, and create a pathway away from open-ended war. His July 30th announcement thanked Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey for their roles as mediators. These are competing interests, not evidence of secret coordination. Two apparently separate developments now look more significant. The first was Iran. A joint operation began with language about regime change, but American officials later emphasized narrower military objectives. The second was Gaza. Trump promoted phased disarmament and withdrawal, while Netanyahu insisted that withdrawal wait for total disarmament. In both cases, the alliance faced the same underlying problem. The two governments could agree on immediate pressure against an adversary. They had greater difficulty agreeing on what should happen afterward. Iran raised the question of political transformation versus military containment. Gaza raised the question of withdrawal before or after disarmament. Turkey raised the question of Israeli qualitative military superiority versus American regional diplomacy. The pattern is not proof of a master strategy. It is evidence of an alliance with overlapping objectives and different thresholds for risk. The United States and Israel do not occupy the same strategic position. Israel is physically inside the region. Its forces, civilians, borders, and neighboring armed groups are directly exposed to the consequences of military decisions. The United States operates from a broader position. Washington must consider global force posture, relations with NATO members, diplomatic coalitions, congressional restrictions, energy markets, and the risk that regional wars expand. That difference produces different time horizons. Israeli leaders may prioritize removing an immediate threat, even if the operation creates diplomatic costs. American presidents may prioritize ending the conflict after extracting a strategic concession, even if Israel believes the concession is incomplete. Neither position automatically proves the other side is acting in bad faith. Netanyahu's demand for complete disarmament reflects Israel's concern that a partial settlement could leave Hamas capable of rebuilding. Trump's phase framework reflects the practical difficulty of demanding total disarmament before any Israeli withdrawal or international deployment occurs. The problem is circular. Israel says it cannot withdraw until Hamas is disarmed. Hamas says disarmament depends on security guarantees and Israeli compliance. International actors cannot stabilize Gaza without a workable security arrangement, and Washington cannot enforce a plan if Israel refuses to implement it. That is why sequencing became the central battlefield. Netanyahu's political incentives were visible, but motive must be described carefully. Israel's prime minister was struggling in the polls ahead of an election scheduled for October 27th and faced pressure from far-right coalition partners. That does not prove that domestic politics caused the rejection. It establishes a political environment in which concessions could carry substantial costs. Trump's incentives were also visible. He had publicly labeled the Board of Peace announcement historic, and framed it as a major milestone in implementing his Gaza plan. That does not prove he valued publicity over security. It does show that the announcement created political expectations before implementation was guaranteed. Hamas's reported position added another layer. A senior official connected disarmament to an international stabilization force and Israeli compliance with ceasefire obligations. That report describes a conditional position attributed to a Hamas official. It does not independently establish that every faction in Gaza accepted the same terms. And Turkey's role complicated the diplomatic map. Trump thanked Ankara as a mediator while Netanyahu opposed a possible F-35 for sale to Turkey. Return now to August 9th. Netanyahu did not merely request clarification. He publicly declared that Israel rejected the 15-point document. He also stated that Israeli forces would not withdraw until Hamas was genuinely disarmed, and that Israel would continue acting against threats to its forces and citizens. The White House had no immediate public response. That silence was meaningful only in a limited sense. It showed that no immediate public response had been reported. It did not prove Washington had no private response, no leverage, or no alternative plan. The common explanation would be simple. Netanyahu rejected Trump because Israeli leaders do not trust Hamas. That explanation contains an obvious security logic. Hamas's disarmament is difficult to verify, and Israel has strong reasons to fear that concealed weapons or armed networks could survive a partial settlement. But it is incomplete. The same dispute also reflects different views of leverage. Trump's framework treats phased implementation as a way to create movement. Netanyahu's position treats phased withdrawal as a risk that could remove Israeli pressure before disarmament is complete. The disagreement is therefore not only about trust in Hamas. It is about whether pressure should be reduced gradually or maintained until the objective is fully achieved. The deeper connection between Gaza, Iran, and Turkey is not a secret pact. There is no public evidence establishing that these events were coordinated as one concealed operation. The connection is alliance authority. On Iran, Trump and Netanyahu shared military action, but publicly emphasized different end states. On Turkey, Washington considered a regional relationship that Jerusalem viewed as a security risk. On Gaza, Trump announced a framework that Netanyahu said Israel did not accept. Each dispute asks who has the authority to define regional security. Trump's model is expansive. It seeks to combine military pressure, diplomacy, multinational participation, and political announcements into a broad American-led order. Netanyahu's model is narrower and more immediate. It prioritizes direct Israeli control over threats and insists that security conditions be met before military freedom is surrendered. The two models can cooperate during an emergency. They collide when the emergency enters its endgame. The biggest reveal is that the alliance's central weakness may not be disagreement. It may be that both governments can announce progress without possessing the same definition of completion. Trump can announce disarmament while Israel says the document is unacceptable. The United States and Israel can conduct a joint Iran campaign while separating regime change from military containment. Washington can pursue Turkish cooperation while Israel warns that an F-35% sale would damage the regional balance. These are not necessarily contradictions in the sense that one statement must be false. They are contradictions of authority. One government can define a diplomatic framework. Another controls whether it will withdraw. One president can decide America's participation in war. Another leader can influence whether the war continues to serve Israel's objectives. One country can be invited to mediate Gaza while simultaneously being treated as a potential military challenger. The partnership therefore works best when the two sides need the same thing at the same time. It becomes unstable when one side believes the immediate crisis is ending and the other believes the underlying threat remains. We know that Trump's Board of Peace announced a phased Gaza disarmament framework on July 30, 2026. We know that the framework linked Hamas's disarmament to an Israeli withdrawal and international stabilization arrangements. We know that Netanyahu publicly rejected the 15-point document on August 9th and said Israeli forces would not withdraw until Hamas was fully disarmed. We know that U.S. and Israeli forces conducted a joint campaign against Iran beginning February 28th, and that public statements later showed differences over regime change and narrower military objectives. We know that a possible F-35 sale to Turkey created tension with Israel, and that Netanyahu publicly opposed the sale. We do not know whether Washington can persuade Israel to accept a revised Gaza sequence. We do not know whether Hamas's reported commitments represent the position of all armed factions, or whether weapons could actually be verified and removed. We do not know whether the Iran campaign has a stable endpoint, or whether the distinction between military containment and regime change will narrow or widen. We do not know whether Turkey will ultimately receive F-35 aircraft. Legal and congressional barriers remained, meaning political support alone would not guarantee a sale. We also do not know whether these disputes represent a temporary negotiation or a lasting transformation in the alliance. And we do not know what private conversations took place beyond the public record. That uncertainty matters because it limits how confidently anyone can assign motives or describe behind-the-scenes decisions. The next crisis may not begin with a missile launch. It may begin with a document, a withdrawal line, a weapons list, or a presidential announcement that one ally believes is already a breakthrough and the other believes is still unacceptable. Trump and Netanyahu can continue cooperating. The cooperation will require them to answer a question neither Gaza nor Iran has resolved. When American strategy and Israeli security priorities diverge, who gets the final word?